everyone, welcome to SoccerX Connected 100 and to our session Improving the Women's Game Worldwide. I'm Katie Wyatt and I'm the women's football correspondent at The Athletic. I'm really excited to get into this issue because there are so many different facets to improving the women's game, so many different things to look at. And this is a discussion that will centre on the gap between the teams at the top and the nations at the top and the bottom of the women's game, how the top of the game can help those lower down and how best practice in order to do this, the positive impact that the World Cup can have on the wider game, and the response to the pay dispute in the US and the upcoming HBO documentary on that issue. We have a really significant panel of excellent speakers and very high profile people in the women's game to help us today. First, we have Kate Mcgrath, who you will probably recognise as a member of the famous 1999 World Cup winning side, a starting defender on the US national team for more than a decade, 2 Olympic gold medals and a silver medal, so quite a substantial trophy cabinet. She retired in 2020 to become a sports analyst for ESPN and NBC, and now she's the head of women's soccer and general manager of the US women's national team, and is the first woman to ever serve in this role, where she oversees the programming and the performance of the US women's national soccer teams. Then we have Sarah Gregorius, who is the Director of Global Policy and Strategic Relations for Women's Football at FIFPro, which is a bit of a mouthful, but a massively important role. She played in 3 World Cups and more than 100 games for the New Zealand national team, multiple Olympics, and has a playing career that took her across the globe before she retired in 2020 and joined FIFPro, which is the Global Players Union, the year before. And finally, we have Lisa Baird, who's the Commissioner for the National Women's Soccer League in America. She's held that role since February 2020 and oversees all the operations to try and grow revenues and audience while she elevates the profile of the league globally. So lots of different people with lots of different perspectives on the women's game, which will hopefully make for a really illuminating discussion. Sarah, I'll come to you first because you're probably best placed to give an overview of where the women's game is as a whole. Can you maybe give us a bit of an insight into the breadth of performance and resources and experience that we have in the women's game globally at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And it's really nice to be here alongside very esteemed other panelists too. Yeah, certainly. I think even though we've seen an unbelievable amount of quite rapid progress in the last 10 years in particular, we know that there's still a lot of fragmentation within the women's football industry, particularly if you're starting to look at professional leagues and professional club environments for players. We know that there aren't necessarily the same amount of opportunities to match the amount of talent that there is out there, and the potential for the industry, I think, until it really is able to meet that, will be limited in some respects. But I agree with you in the sense that there is so many opportunities out there. We just need to kind of narrow in on the ones that are going to make the biggest difference. And that's why today's panel is so interesting, because the example that's been set in the NWSL and by the US women's national team is, in terms of role modeling, it's significantly important. And we know that a lot of other nations around the world and a lot of other emerging leagues around the world are looking to emulate what's been started in those territories and in that market in particular. So it's really exciting, but I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that the top has a real big role to play in pulling up the bottom, but really the bottom in some respects is a long way off from ever being able to achieve what's been achieved at the top. So it's important that we try and find a strategy that builds in a way that brings everyone along on their journey, because until we find a method to do that, unfortunately, we might actually see the gap continue to grow and grow and grow.
It's very interesting that you said that about the role that those at the top have in dragging everybody else up. And Kate, I was wondering, because you hear a lot about how US women's national team are involved with other nations in a kind of template that they use, or they maybe consult a little bit with other nations. Can you give a bit of an insight into that role specifically that the US women's national team have in flying the flag for other nations and inspiring them and encouraging them, and that side of their existence?
I think the great thing about the US women's national team throughout history is they're always ones to push boundaries, and there are no artificial limits in what can be done and what is deserved and what can be achieved. And I think that sort of mentality is contagious. And the beautiful thing about our domestic league and the NWSL, which has been our most successful one, and Lisa is doing a fantastic job building the profile of that, is that other players from other parts of the world are coming in and playing, and they're playing next to people at all levels in our pro league, some that will be fantastic pro players, some that will potentially be in the women's national team pool, and some that are the stars of our team. But collectively, they're all going through the same experience and then going back to their respective domains, and everyone has been influenced by one another. And I think what we're seeing globally, most importantly, is women are finally all collectively realizing we need to work together in order to improve the game for everybody and increase the opportunities, but to make sure that we're not just doing a top-down approach for the apex to the ground, but also the ground up. Because like Sarah's saying, if we don't do it that way, I do believe there'll be a fracturing. So it's important to have conversations like this. We're all in different parts of the world, and we're able to connect. And that's probably the best thing about COVID, is that we're now so comfortable in this forum, but it allows for these conversations to happen regardless of where we're currently living.
Yeah, you alluded to it a little bit there, Kate, about people being based all over the world, and as a result of that, you will have lots of different nuances and different challenges when you're coming to build a league. And Lisa, it's very interesting the form that the NWSL takes, because you have a lot of independence from men's football and from men's clubs, which is very different to the model that we have in England. Could you give a bit of an insight into the challenges that you face growing a league in that model, or the things that you focus on, or just generally trying to build up a brand within very different parameters to what we're used to in England?
Yeah, I think it is very different in England, and I've been lucky enough to be able to meet a lot of my counterparts and other professional leagues, including the FA, to kind of learn from one another. First of all, you said something I think that's very important. The National Women's Soccer League is 100% independent this year. For the first 9 years of our existence, we had a manager with our federation, US Soccer, which is a model that is, I think I've seen around the world in other leagues. But now we are completely independent, although we have a very deep partnership with US Soccer, very deep. I mean, Kate and my head of sport operations talk at least once a week. I just was out touring one of their national training centers, but we're independent. And that is different in women's sports. And what it means is you can kind of control your own destiny, but you also have to fund it. You have to rise to the level of the standards of all sports, not just men's soccer, but all sports, particularly because that's what journalists are writing about. And, there's a challenge, but there's also an independent and a freedom about it that we like in the United States. And so we're charting our own destiny at 9 years of age.
With that, because it's very interesting that you touched on professionalism there. And Sarah, there was big news coming out of Spain this week, and a lot of people reflecting on the fact that Barcelona, who have just won the Champions League, have some of the best and highest paid players in the women's game, are competing in a league that still has amateur status. Can you give a bit of an insight into what that means and how significant it is to make sure that these players that appear to have it all from the outside at club level are perhaps still competing in leagues that are maybe not up to scratch in other ways? Yeah,
it's so important. It's actually very fundamental to how we're actually going to raise the conditions for players around the world. If your league or your industry in your particular country does not have professional designation, you're actually not recognized as a worker. So, and if you're not recognized as a worker, you actually can't access very basic fundamental workers' rights and protections in that country. So not being acknowledged and not having that status can be detrimental. You're talking about not being able to access social security, pension, depending on which country you're talking about, like certain provisions to do with pregnancy and maternity policy as well. So the downstream effects of not being recognized at that level in terms of the impact on the players is quite devastating. So that work to raise the status of players to professional is very, very important. It's obviously about more than just contract and whether or not professional obligations and remuneration are in place. It's actually whether or not you're recognized as a worker. So it's wild actually to think that Barcelona can win the Champions League and be unbelievably successful and have all of these unbelievable players, but actually they are not recognized. Their industry is not recognized as professional, and they're not recognized as workers as a result of that. And actually, there are very few places in the world where women's footballers have that designation. So it's a huge part of the work that still needs to be done, because actually, if you want to start improving conditions, for workers, get them recognized as workers in the first place. So that's so fundamental, and I think it's sometimes overlooked that actually those types of provisions enable other professional conditions to take place. So it's really vital, and I very much am supportive of really honing in on that in terms of the cultural and social context that players are trying to operate in, and figuring out like exactly what the barriers are, because sometimes it's that significant. It's just the inability to be recognized as a worker. So it's really great work that our union AFE are doing over in Spain, but I think it just goes to show that sometimes, despite all the bells and whistles that you may see or may hear about, or even your perception of a club like Barcelona, sometimes the reality for the players is actually far from what you would maybe expect it to be.
And it's interesting because in the WSL in England, which is where I'm speaking from, we get bogged down in the debate about minimum standards and why these clubs are not doing this, and they should be following the lead of Chelsea, Arsenal, Manchester City. But it's interesting that you tapped into something as basic as just being seen as a worker as being the barrier. But what are the other barriers? Because there will be lots of cultural and societal nuances to this depending on where you go. What are you sort of seeing across the globe in that respect?
Essentially, in terms of across the globe, it's vast, it's as fragmented as the industry itself. Sometimes it's the way women are viewed in society in certain parts of the world, right? And that's a challenge in itself. Sometimes it's to do with, and you touched on a little bit, where actually, and to Lisa's point earlier about independence, sometimes being attached to a parent club, if you like, in terms of the men's side of the football club is really beneficial, but at the same time you're not able to have that independence and create your own value away from that, and then decisions that are made in the men's football industry impact you without you actually being considered in a fair and equitable way. So there are many different ways that you can look at it, from like the position of women in that specific society, how they're actually funded, and the level of independence and autonomy they're able to have over the decision making. And then there's all of the other stuff, and sometimes it's just straight up misogyny that we see in other parts of the world, and that takes a different set of tactics and a different approach entirely in order to make sure that those barriers are being broken down. So I wish it was as simple as to say like there is one specific thing, because if we're really taking that global point of view like we do at FIFPro, you actually have to really dive into the detail and the domestic construct and the domestic environment that these players are operating in, and think, okay, what can we constructively put in place to help mitigate some of the discrimination that we're seeing in terms of holding them back. And then obviously there are other things to consider. What's the role of FIFA? What's the role of the confederations? And how can these other competition organizers stimulate women's football, stimulate, I guess, access and equity in terms of opportunity and things like that, and all of the items that come with that. There is obviously that role over there, but yeah, it would certainly make my job easier if there was one silver bullet, but the issues are as fragmented as the industry itself.
And Lisa, Sarah was touching there on how sometimes in certain countries you're maybe beholden to the will or the resources in the men's game. How have you found, because we sort of spoke a little bit about it earlier, but how have you found constructing that league, and what are the challenges that you've had as being entirely independent for the first time and trying to build up your 9 years into a hopefully lifetime project? How are you finding all of that?
Well, it's pretty much 24/7 right now, because with independence becomes a lot of, it's not very like glamorous work. People expect me to do a lot of that, but for example, writing a new LLC agreement, making sure that we're conforming to the independent laws, putting together our strategic plan, which we've been very invested in with our ownership, so that we have a roadmap for the next 10 years. Because we need to do that. We are also in active bargaining with the first collective bargaining agreement with our players. That's another inflection point for us. And we've had a long and positive history with our players of raising compensation and benefits. They're treated as workers in every definition of the word, in court, legal, as well as how we do them. But there's more to work to be done there. And I'd like to point to the fact that, I talk about the future, and I'm very positive about the future of the women's game globally, as well as in the US, but there's a lot of dynamic change happening in sports. And so the context of what we're doing is not the microcosm of soccer at all. It is what is happening broadly in sports, with broadcasting models changing worldwide, with how media is consumed, with how fans are interacting with the game, you know, both live as well as through digital mechanisms, to how how social media is changing the you know, kind of the power of the athletes' voices. These are all fundamental changes that are going through sport right now. So you've got to have the ability to have the core constructs to kind of make sure that our fledgling league, because we're only 9 years old, is sustainable and operating, but also be able to ambitious enough to be putting into place the long-term initiatives that will grow the game and grow the league worldwide. So it's definitely a challenging time, but I think our owners and our stakeholders are up to it. We've been very lucky in that in the last 6 months, we've had a number of global sponsors come into the women's game, and you know, securing the revenue going forward is critical for the professional league. You know, we have to have that. So we've been really lucky to have the momentum on our side, and I think that's true for the women's game generally in the world. But we've got to be strong enough and sustainable enough to be able to grow in a stable fashion. Too many women's leagues have folded. Yeah.
And well, how do you make sure that you're not the one that folds?
It's exactly what I said. Having a growth plan, having strategy, having the actual constructs that you need across every single aspect of running a league, Katie. It's the not only the marketing and sales plan to secure the revenue, it's having an LLC agreement, it's having a CBA agreement, it's having, I don't call them minimum standards ever, I call them team standards, so that there's a consistent level across all our teams. It's having the right balance of rules. One of the things that separates the US league is the intense parity that we have in our league. So any given weekend or midweek, as it happens, you can see excitement on the pitch all the time. And in the American sports landscape, parity is very important to the success of any league, men or women. Look at it. So being able to have that parity and that intensity, but also recognizing that we operate in a global economy for players, getting that balance right is really a big focus for us at the ownership level. And that we look at rules, we look at how we can make the fan experience exciting. We look at, Katie, this is something we talked about earlier. One of the things that I continue to battle against, and I think all women's sports do, is look at the media coverage for women's sports as it compares to men's sports. Less than 5% of all media coverage is on women's sports. The one lone thing that I can think of that's different from that is the Olympics. But they've been around 300 years. So maybe they have a bit of advantage. But why is it that women's sports continues to just have less than 5%? With media exposure comes all of the things that we need to professionalize and grow the women's games. And it's something that we run up against every day. I've been quite vocal about the challenge and the frustration there is in that.
It's a really timely point that you make, because we were discussing this sort of in the background a few days ago, and it's a really crucial thing that I guess I've been thinking about this for a few days, that with the lack of diversity that we have in our media, you're very much beholden to men to not only kind of exercise the corporate social responsibility idea of we have this moral obligation to cover women's sport, but also to maybe see what a lot of people can't at the moment, which is the huge commercial growth potential that women's sport has, and that I think a lot of people are quite reluctant to engage with sometimes in certain areas. But it's interesting that you brought up how you're now operating a landscape where you've got different broadcasters than you had before, you've got social media. How are you maybe building this league where you're taking in maybe different media partners that we've never seen in sports before? You're building a league in a very different era to the one that, let's say, the Premier League or the MLS were built in 5, 10, 20 years ago.
I think it is very different, and it's definitely exciting. So we had last year during the pandemic, we had just announced 2 different media partnerships. One with CBS Viacom, which is a big broadcaster that had the U.S. rights, and then another was Twitch, which is our streaming partner, which gives us not only national and global games but international distribution. What was interesting about launching 2 media partnerships in the pandemic is, of course, we had to renegotiate all those deals with the pandemic. But what it did is it gave us 2 vehicles to really let our audience of fans discover us. What was so interesting is that as we started to realize the exposure, because of the pandemic, we were able to take advantage of some very, very appealing windows in both the US and internationally as we were building this. And we found that the audience found us. And I think that goes to something that we're looking at right now, which is the women's sports fan is used to finding us in streaming channels and digital channels. That's where women's sports was relegated for so long. And so it's almost kind of an advantage for women's sports, because now that we are using our learning and our expertise to really grow these digital audiences, where the next generation of fan is, they are already there. And there's a lot of leagues that are struggling with older audiences that need to down age them, that we're already having an advantage of being able to be really digital savvy with our game, with our coverage, with the surrounding stories. So we're leaning in to the digital experience in a way that I don't think men's sports is, but still being able to get the coverage from the media, which is not only the game production, but the coverage of the stories and the athletes around it is something that we're really pushing up against, and that will generate it. And it was interesting. I think that the biggest question, and I'm scratching my head still, is I don't know if you're aware of this in the pandemic, but last year the National Women's Soccer League was the first league back of any league, men's and women's. We were the first league back. We had audience ratings on CBS and on Twitch that rivaled men's games, even European leagues, which broadcasting in the US, and yet the media ignored the story. That's the part I don't understand. We had ratings, we had audience, we were the first league back. We came back and did a smaller thing and generated again record ratings. As we came back this year, we generated another 3rd highest audience, and yet we still don't get the level of coverage that women's sports needs in mainstream press.
Kate, I want to come to you because you're obviously overseeing one of the highest achieving and best funded women's national teams in the world. How do you find it when it comes to playing other teams? Do you struggle maybe to find other nations that are at the same caliber, or that even have maybe a functioning women's program? Because a stat that I was reading yesterday, that 150 nations are registered having a FIFA program, but really only about a third of those could be considered to have a proper, legitimate, well-funded program, if that makes sense.
Well, it really just depends, honestly, where we are in the year and what each confederation is doing for their own championships, for example. But generally, pre-COVID, we did not have a problem finding a wonderful balance of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 teams, and tiering just solely being on how well they're funded, because that's usually a mediator for how good they are in their performance of it. But there's something to be said about making sure that you're playing all levels of teams. And something that they did with the Youth World Cups on the women's side is they'll go to these countries and place it there in hopes that it spurs development, because you cannot break bias in 1 hour. We cannot break bias in what Lisa's facing, what Sarah's facing in their daily job, just by having a DEIB or a DEI seminar. It doesn't work that way. You have to break the habit. And one way to break the habit is to raise awareness. One way to do that is to bring the game in your backyard and for people of your culture to see it and to be like, oh, how come our girls aren't doing that, right? And that's something that I think FIFA has done a really good job of in exploring that and bringing the game to everyone. And our job is to go out and play our very best and do the very best we can, because that performance speaks to the funding that has been going on, thankfully, since the advent of Title IX. And I used to do a lot of mission trips for our government. They're called sports diplomacy trips that they put on. And I've been to Ethiopia, Peru, Chile. And I remember meeting with the the first lady of Chile, and she's like, how can we get women and girls the same opportunities? And I'm like, you have to break the bias, and you have to do that perhaps by creating laws, because that's what happened in the United States with Title IX. And that is the reason why we could compete with the European teams that, although they're paired most of the time with male teams, they did have pro leagues. So the players were exposed to higher level environments. And ours used to be collegiate, right? And that still is a main part of our developmental platform. So for us, it's making sure that we can bring the game to everywhere, because we have been funded very well. I was a benefactor of that as a player for many, many, many years. I won't say how many years, but then moving on, then now on the other side is how can I continue that? Because you have to earn this. We all have to earn the right to break all these biases. And we have to do that by continuing to push it. Lisa's done a great job of thinking outside the box, because you can't do the same thing that you've always done. And I think her hire, coming from the business background, is she broke up that valid reason that everyone thought, well, this is how we always did it, this is how we should do it. Well, guess what? Now they're bringing in more money sponsorship wise than they ever have. They're getting on bigger platforms and continuing to knock on that door as more female players become commonplace, their name and likeness in the marketplace in the United States and globally.
Are you able to give an update on what's happening with the equal pay things in America? Because obviously you are one of the better teams, but then the players have been at the heart of this movement that's received a lot of coverage. Can you give a bit of an insight into where those discussions are at the moment?
I really can't, because I'm not part of those discussions. And that's one thing that I'll leave it to the people that are in that on a day-to-day basis. And because my job is about looking forward, because in order to earn the top level every cycle, you just have to fully invest yourself and your focus on that. And that's the role of my job, is not just to do it for the senior women's national team, but trying to create the platform for our 17s who will be playing in 10 years at the senior level. So for us, it's I look at it as a holistic approach, top down, and that's primarily my focus.
Sarah, obviously we've seen the World Cup has been such a fundamental thing for the US teams in the past. They've had some really iconic moments, and it's in turn really elevated their profile. And what can you imagine the global impact of that being on all the different breadth of nations and range of resources and funded teams and across the globe, and how much of an impact can you imagine that having at the range of teams that will be competing there?
It can't be underestimated what a stimulant the Women's World Cup can be for nations around the world. We can already see, like, as soon as the announcement was made that it was going to go from 24 to 32 teams, it stimulated activity in parts of the world that weren't stimulated up until that point, because they have an opportunity to get another slot or another opportunity that seemed very far away when it was a smaller amount of teams that competed at that level. So it's an unbelievable stimulant, and it can provide opportunities quicker, in my view, for professionalization than sometimes waiting for clubs and leagues to get off the ground, because we know that the national team can play a really important role in the all-round employment for women's players. And that's quite a strong difference between the men's and women's football industry, is the role of national team football. Case in point, with the other two women on the call, and the link between the NWSL and the US women's national team and allocated players and that type of system, we know, even at that very high end of the game, how important that synergy between club and national team football is in the women's game. So I don't think it can be underestimated at all, the impact that the Women's World Cup can have on the women's football industry globally, not just national team football, but professional football in general. I'm like, I wouldn't say I'm wholly and completely gutted, but a part of me wonders like what the opportunity cost in terms of COVID is, that we weren't able to continue the momentum from the 2019 World Cup to the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, because we just know that so much happens around these milestone events in the competition cycle, not just for the athletes themselves, but what it does for the visibility and growth of the sport, and the way that it can like really spur on clubs and leagues and international club competitions, which we don't see enough of, and that type of, I guess, ecosystem in general. So I sometimes I'm not 100% sure if like it's actually fully been realized yet. The potential of the Women's World Cup is that real like injection over the long term in terms of the stability, equity, equality around the sport more broadly. It's just so vital. And for me as a player, when I went to the World Cup in 2011, I would actually, what I was in the shop window, and my performances in 2011 got me my first professional contract. And that again is the dynamic that these tournaments can play. And as soon as you've got 32 teams and more players participating in 2023, like those possibilities become more apparent to more players in general. So, I mean, in short, yeah, I'm very excited to see what it does for the industry, but I think proactively, we can put some things in place now to capitalize on the opportunity that 2023 will present to us.
Kate and Lisa, I want to come to you both on this and to have a bit of a dialogue, because Sarah was saying there about how obviously you're a very good example of a team that has had success on the national stage and then being able to translate that over to a very successful and healthy league. And what would your advice be to maybe other countries and other leagues in that situation? Because one of the big barriers that we have in England is that we have immense interest around major tournaments, but not that much success necessarily in translating that to regular fans who are attending games very often.
It's a great question. And, I mean, I think this sounds, kind of obvious, but the first thing starts with a good partnership between the federation and the professional league. And it sounds silly, but we have a very good partnership with US Soccer. Not that it doesn't have its challenges. I mean, we will have differences of opinion, but the partnership is so embedded that because it is more complicated to create a schedule, run a professional league schedule, and do it within the global schedule to allow for all this, you've got to have that good partnership. And I think that's one thing that I've observed with some of my counterparts in all leagues, that fundamental partnerships there. I think the second of it is this. And I can only speak from the U.S. market. While we aspire to be, a big globally, we're still U.S. based, and for the most part, most of our players come from the U.S. But I don't look at just soccer for our model. I look at the national, the NBA, the NHL, who have somehow figured out how to run a very successful professional league, as well as fully participate in world tournaments, whether those are youth tournaments or Olympics or, FIBA associations. They figured that balance out. And I think we're still figuring out, because the schedule does become challenging. The amount of money that we need to raise, because our women, they want careers. The tournament, you're right, the World Cup tournament or the Olympic tournament is just this huge peak of publicity. But having spent years in the Olympic movement, what I know about the peak is that it drops right back down unless you have somewhere to send the fans. It's the Olympics that struggled with that for a century. So what we've got to do is create that model of around the world sending the best players to the world events, to the Olympics and to the World Cup with FIFA, but then also being able to generate those stories and have those regular seasons to lift the boats beyond just the tournament period. That's the issue. And that's where I think it starts with partnership. It starts with sponsors, funding, broadcast partners, media exposure. It's kind of building this holistic ecosystem where we can use the power of the world events, but also have professional leagues. I mean, the NBA, they love playing in the Olympics. They love playing in the FIBA, but they're also deeply committed to making sure that their leagues run smoothly and sustainably. So we have a lot to learn to love, because remember, women's soccer is still very early on in its nascency. I don't know, Kate, what do you think?
Yeah,
I think the partnership.
Yeah, I think you're right. Well, the partnership works because of course, there are challenges, and we are constantly working through them through communication. But I think
every day, right, Kate?
Every day, one of us is talking to somebody else within the organization. But here's the thing: is we have two things in common. One is we both want to grow women's sports, and we know we need each other to do that. Secondly, it's mutually beneficial for both of us to be successful. And the NWSL is basically a fourth grader. And that's something that I always tell people. I was like, we need to have high expectations, but we also need to understand that essentially it's 9 years old compared to the MLS, which is, it's grown and flown. It's an adult, it's in its 20s. So soccer in general in America in a professionalized high level it's a newborn in a lot of ways compared to our peers, especially in Europe. So that partnership, we need to depend on each other. So it's a little bit out of necessity as well, and one that we'll continue to have, because I think we both need it. But again, it's continued conversations, and then the work with FIFPro as well. I mean, I think Amanda, formerly Amanda, now Sarah, is talking about those standards and raising it, because being a former player, a lot of times you were told, well, you should be happy, or you should be lucky that you even have this. And I heard that all the time, and I'm in my mid-40s, right? And that no longer is a valid reason for accepting suboptimal standards. And it's being held accountable to that in a way that doesn't stifle investment and doesn't stifle continued development, but it enables to check it, fix it, correct it, be held accountable, and move forward.
A related questions, we've had a few audience questions come in. One from AJ, he says, I don't know who would like to answer this, but the recent report from FIFA shows that there is a strong interest in the women's game, but the average number of games in women's league across the world is fewer than in the men's game. If the product, i.e. more games, are not there, how will the game grow? And what can be done in relation to this to get more games played?
Maybe
Sarah,
I can offer maybe a global snapshot of that as well. And we said, I mean, quite realistically, the highest amount of teams in a league at the minute is 16 in women's football. It's almost double in some leagues in the men's competitions. I mean, the MLS as well, it's got more teams sometimes than I think it knows what to do with. So there's that. There actually aren't, and I said this earlier, there aren't enough clubs and professional opportunities to sustain more and more games, right? Because you also don't want to get into a situation where it's just a few playing each other all the time. I mean, let's not get into the whole Super League debacle where they tried to float that idea and look where that got them. So there's that, right? The leagues aren't as big as they could be or should be. And that means that all of a sudden you end up with a far shorter season, less teams, and obviously less match opportunities. I think the challenge, and it's a bit of a continuation on the back and forth that Lisa and Kate were having before, that's why the marriage between club and national team football is so important, because what they can do together is create this really coherent, really balanced competition cycle that not only provides enough competitive opportunities for the industry to grow to the point of the person asking the question, but players are able to develop, talent is actually able to be actualized. There needs to be that coherency and that marriage of the opportunities to make sure that what we end up with is this very succinct, very efficient, very competitively balanced competition cycle for a maximum amount of participants. So it's not just a case of let's just up the matches, get everyone to play each other 3 times instead of 2. It's like, how do we actually formulate a calendar that provides opportunity, visibility, and growth in a number of different markets in a number of different areas? And if you start to think about that from a player-centric point of view, the solution becomes a little bit more evident, right? It's balance. You also can't flog players. They can't play too much. Look at the lessons that we're having to learn from the men's football industry and all of the competing interests and actually the burnout that it applies to the players. So the short answer is, yeah, there is space on the calendar for more games, but we will create a problem for ourselves if the different groups don't speak to each other and come together in a collaborative way to put together an entire competition cycle where everyone's needs are being met, starting with the players, starting with the organizations that are trying to grow the game, starting with the leagues, competition organizers, all of that. But the opportunity is there. But if we don't take it, we're going to lose it, and we're going to end up with a bit of a fight down the track when there's all of these other competing interests.
Yeah, and just to build on that, what Sarah's saying is she's talking about the stability, and the only way to launch is from a platform, right? You need stability before you go to chaos, which is what competition is in the game. But you need to have the platform in order to leverage that. And the biggest part for me in order to do that is changing the mindset of what a roster size should be on the women's game. You need to have a fully funded roster. If you really want the women's to have a full coherent competition calendar that allows them to reach heights for club and country for those that are at that level, you also need a very deep roster that is also well paid. So that's the hardest part that I see so far in the women's game. So if we can get a deeper roster, we can have more competition, because then you can get roster rotation, increased development, not only from the investment side, but also from the player side. So the whole entire level of the game will grow exponentially from a technical standpoint.
And to add on, to build onto that too, it's not only the deep rosters and fully funded, but the support services that go along for the teams, for the players, which is the best coaches, a diverse set of coaches, the best refereeing. These are all the support systems that have to be built into the women's game worldwide, that have existed in the men's soccer game for, many years in Europe and South America, but not so much in the US. But we are in the process of building all that as well. So that's again, when I look at it, I go, I kind of talk to my owners and say measured growth is better than fast growth in our case. And what is the right amount of games? I'll give you a really simple answer. The right amount of games is the number of games that the fans will attend live person, that people will watch on TV in the professional area. At the end of the day, if fans aren't going to stadiums, attending the live games, and if people aren't going in and tuning in on the broadcast or on the streaming platform, what are the players playing for at the end of the day? So we've got a measured growth to continue that. And there's a lot of interesting things. Some people want to have a very full calendar and have games every day. Right now we're 12 at home, 12 away, but look at the NFL. They have 17 games in an entire season. They seem to be doing okay. So I think we'll just have to discover that.
Kate, I imagine that you're probably best placed to answer this, but if anybody else, feel free to jump in. Ricardo has sent in a question to say that the Canadian Soccer Association has a one strategic plan with no distinction between the men's and women's game. What are your opinions on this? Does this hold back the women's game from creating their own path and generating awareness, or is it the best way forward?
I think it just depends on what country you're from, and you have to look at the dynamics and the context from which the players are coming. And for me, I think gender neutral is always a great starting point. And then once you're in that gender neutrality approach, and as you're looking to build the parameters, there needs to be gender. Now, I always have a hard time with this word. My lisp is coming out, specificity. All that speech training at 5th grade doesn't pay off sometimes with that word. But unfortunately, that's a really important part of how we approach programming, is how can we make sure that we're not recreating the wheel as an MA with the men's side and the women's side. And that's what we've done. And the benefit of COVID, the silver lining, is we have turned everything into, we're talking across the aisle now, the men's and women's teams, the youth teams, all our coaches, they work together on building our new style of play, everything. But there is moments where it's gender specific, right? Not to get too technical, but I think there are certain things that we can learn from one another, but then you have to also accept that women are playing in a different context than the men are. We're playing in a patriarchal society, trying to always break down gender norms, trying to increase our real estate in the national attention that doesn't just come at World Cup and Olympics, and then continue to grow the sport so that, there's more names and likenesses that are household names for all of us. So yes, learn the best from each other and then move forward. And something to be said about the men learning from us too. So I think it's a fascinating approach, and it's one that we're looking at and taking the best from each other as we move forward, but adapting it to our needs in particular.
We've only got 2 minutes left, but I just want to direct one last question to, I think, Sarah, maybe you might be the best place to answer this, given your kind of global perspective. Jess says, does the dominance of certain women teams in certain countries like Barcelona actually hinder the growth of the game nationally, or is the top of the mountain quality most important?
Well, I wouldn't say it's most important. Definitely not. You have to look at what's underneath, and I think that we established that quite early on in the conversation. What I will say though is when you have people that pull away, organizations and clubs that pull away, the example and the expectation that it sets is very important. You need to have people that push the boundaries and that do things differently and do things better, because it sets a new standard. So I wouldn't say it's the most important, but far out, it's very important that people don't stand still, because by standing still and waiting for other people to catch up, sometimes you stifle innovation and you stifle the motivation of others to push ahead and to improve. So I think it's really important to look at always what the best of the best are doing. Where is the innovation? Where are they gaining that competitive advantage? Because we're playing a sport. People are competing. They want to do the best that they can with what they've got. And if an example is being set around and always being pushed out, what is best, then that improves everybody else. It maybe doesn't happen always in a fast enough way or coherent way specifically. But if people aren't pushing the ceiling, that's not healthy. That's not good. We need that. We need the Barcelonas of the world. We need the US women's national team. We need clubs in the different markets that pull away. Look at what Lyon did in terms of spurring on PSG in the French division. So it's vital. Is it the most important? I wouldn't go that far, but we cannot do away with people that push the boundaries. Clubs, individual players, it has to be there in order for others to realize where they can go and what the example actually is.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. We're just down to the final few seconds. So thank you to our wonderful panel for their insights and contributions. Back to you in the studio.